Hi readers, Chris here. Today I'm going to be talking about Lakesedge by Lyndall Clipstone. Yes, I'm in a bit of a different location today. Hopefully you can't hear the laundry running in the background. Sorry if you can. Lakesedge came to me in an Owlcrate book box back last year, so 2021. And first thing I want to say is look how cool this book is. This is actually the hard cover. There's no dust jacket on this book. Like, this is the hard case, which I think is really, really cool. It's definitely has a Gothic feel to it. And it's funny because when I posted my review over on Instagram, a couple people asked me, like, what does that mean? What is a Gothic book, especially a Gothic YA book? And I'm sure there is an official definition, but to me, I'm going to say that Gothic is the feeling that you get when you look at the cover of this book. Think of like a spooky old house, a dark forest. If you are familiar at all with Edgar Allan Poe, you know, things that are dark and eerie, but not horror. Horror and Gothic are two different things. You can be horror and Gothic for sure, but they're not the same. So yes, think Edgar Allan Poe, dark, mysterious, you know, some eerie vibes, stuff like that. Hopefully those type of things are really what like Gothic is all about. And I love me some Gothic tales. So I'm going to talk about world building, characters, and plot. So let me give you a brief setup of this book. So the setup of this book is we have a young girl. Her name is Violetta, Violet for short, and she has a younger brother named Arian or Arian. I'm going to say Arian. And her younger brother has this mysterious power that no one really knows what it is, but basically, like, he has these episodes where he's kind of consumed with this dark power, like shadows kind of pour from him. He can't control this darkness, and she is kind of the only one in his life that can like kind of help bring him back to the light. Now, in the beginning of the book, they are living with this woman who they refer to as mother, but she's really their adopted mother. She's not like their birth mother. And she's a horrible mother because she's abusive to them. Because Violet has to kind of hide her brother's abilities, hide his power, like she takes a lot of the blame for what he does, what happens to him. So one day they wander into their town and there's this festival going on, and they start to hear rumors that the Lord of Lakesedge, which is like a manor house on the other side of the wood, is coming to this festival. And everyone's really scared because there's all these rumors surrounding this guy. Everyone refers to him as a monster because he allegedly killed his whole family. He doesn't come out much. He lives in this spooky house in this lake, on the edge of the lake, and this lake is like filled with this dark power, etc., etc., etc. So while Violetta and her brother are at this festival, her brother starts to have one of these fits where he's getting consumed by this dark energy. He runs off into the forest, she runs out after him, and they end up coming across the Lord of Lakesedge Manor, aka the Monster. And he's like, hey, I think with your power, your brother's power, you can help me with something. So why don't you come back to my manor and help me try to defeat the darkness that's going on there. What follows after that is basically this exploration of darkness, of shadows, of light. It's Violet and her brother and this monster and a couple people that live with him. There's this darkness that's not only spreading from the lake and spreading throughout the manor house, but like if they don't stop it, eventually it's just going to spread everywhere and everything's going to be covered in this darkness. So that's kind of the basic setup. So when it comes to world building, like most of the book, what I just explained, the setup is really like the first couple chapters, but pretty much the entire rest of the book takes place at Lakesedge Manor. It takes place in the manor house and at the lake because they spend all of their time there trying to figure out how to stop this darkness from spreading. So in terms of quote unquote world building, the actual setting is small and contained into this one location. However, I will say that as the story goes along and you start to learn about why Arian has these powers, what he can do with these powers, and then our monster, the Lord of Lakesedge, what really happened to him in his past and what's going on with him. Like, there is a really cool lore to this book, a really cool lore. And I like how the book approaches the lore because it's very much based on a simple premise where you have like the darkness versus the light, but there's also like this fantastical element about it as well. Obviously, the kid has powers, the brother has powers, but it's more than that. It's more than that. Like, there is an evil presence in the lake, and an evil that's like gonna take over if everyone doesn't come together and defeat it. And I'm probably not doing a good job explaining it, but all of that to say, I really like the world building in this book. I like the lore in this book. I like that it leaves room to grow as well. I did not realize when I first picked up this book that there was going to be a sequel. I will say here and now that this is a complete story. It is a complete story. It does not end on like some crazy cliffhanger where it's going to be annoying, but it definitely leaves room for growth. It opens up the doors to like all these other cool things that hopefully in the sequel will be really cool. So let's talk about our characters for a minute here. So for all intents and purposes, there's really two main characters in this book. One being Violet. The story is pretty much told from her perspective. She's our main character. We follow her journey. And on one hand, I will say that she does fall into some of those typical YA fantasy tropes where she doesn't think she's special, but she is special. There is a romance in this book. I mean, it's really not surprising. Like, none of that stuff is surprising. But I do think that, again, I feel like I've said this a lot recently in my reviews, but I like that she's not a perfect character. She is an imperfect character. Because, her and her brother had a abusive adoptive mother for so long. Like, she is very protective of her brother, very protective of him. But she's protective of him to the point where, like, she makes mistakes and her protectiveness gets in the way of him like moving forward in his life, if that makes any sense. So there's definitely like, she struggles a lot in this book. She struggles to, kind of figure out what her role is, and if her role is no longer protecting her brother, like, what is she gonna do? So I think she has a cool story arc, although I will say that the romance aspect of the book was pretty typical for a YA fantasy. Nothing really surprising about it, so, I mean, take it or leave it. If you've read a lot of YA fantasy, you should know if you like that stuff or not at this point. I don't mind it as long as it's not too corny, and I don't think it's corny in here. I don't think it's corny, I just don't think that it's anything new and exciting. So now let's talk about the other quote-unquote main character, who is the Lord of Lakesedge Manor, aka the monster. So like I said in the beginning, there are all these rumors and mysteries surrounding him. When Violet first meets him, she really does think that he is a monster. She thinks that he is a murderer, etc., etc., etc. Now, to stay out of spoiler territory, I'm going to be very vague here, but I will say that A lot of the rumors about him are true. However, they're not true in the way that you think they are. So make a guess. Take that as you will. The rumors are true, just not in the way that you think they are. But at the heart of it, like, yes, he kind of is a monster. Like, he lives in this dark house. He has these dark powers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, he is also trying to do good by stopping the darkness from spreading everywhere else. I think that he is probably the most interesting character out of this whole story because he's got a really cool backstory, a really interesting backstory. He's very mysterious, and we kind of learn bits and pieces about him, you know, as the story goes along. As Violet learns more about him and about who he is, so do we as well. Again, the romance part, very predictable. I'm just going to say it again for the sake of saying it again, but out of Violet and the monster character, I think I like the monster more. And I suppose for the sake of this video, I should talk about Arian a little bit more. Like I mentioned, you know, in the beginning, he's the younger brother. He has these dark powers. And as I kind of alluded to when I was talking about, you know, the world building and talking a little bit about Violet, he also has a very interesting arc in this book, a very interesting arc, because he has spent his whole life, you know, dealing with this power that A, he couldn't control, B, he didn't know anything about, and C, is pretty much like terrified. But as the story goes along, things start to change for him. And I don't want to say exactly in what way, but let's just say that he has a very interesting arc, and I think a very, you know, it's kind of a typical YA arc, but I think the book does a good job with all the nuances of his character. Now, again, there are some other characters in the book. The Lakesedge Manor, it's not just the Lord that lives there. He has like a couple minions, if you will, that live with him. And I think those characters are fine. None of them really like popped out at me. None of them jumped out at me. So I can't say that this book has fantastic side characters. I think the main characters, the three I mentioned, are the best. And the other ones, like, yeah, they're there, they're fine. Sometimes they add a little bit of humor or a little bit of this and that. I feel like they're just other people for like Violet to interact with at some point. So, whatever, it's fine. Moving on. So now that brings me to the plot, which I've pretty much already talked about, I think, at this point. So I don't know why I keep doing this. So let me just focus on like the way that the book is written. When the book started out, I would say, you know, through the first, maybe third, maybe 25 to 30%, I did kind of think that this was going to be a standard YA fantasy, you know, with a little bit of a Gothic feel, and that it wasn't really going to be anything special. However, as the plot moves along, moves into the halfway point, and then especially in the second half of the book, like things really start to pick up, really start to move along. And even though most of the plot takes place at this one location, like I think the book does a really good job of keeping the story interesting and keeping you engaged as a reader. Because like I said, as Violet goes throughout this journey and she starts to learn bits and pieces about all the things happening around her, like we get to learn that as a reader. And I think that is a really cool experience. I love when like a character doesn't know everything and the book doesn't just give it to you, you get to discover it with the reader. Like that's the kind of reading experience that I enjoy most, like getting to discover things as the characters discover them. So that's just a personal preference, but that helped to make this book really enjoyable for me. all of that to say, is this my favorite book? No, it's not my favorite book. It's not the best book I've ever written. However, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. I thought it had great characters, great world building and lore, and a great plot. You know, it's really enjoyable for what is supposed to be a YA Gothic fantasy. I think that's exactly what you get with this. It's exactly what you get. So if that's what you're looking for, I think definitely give this one a try. Again, it does fall into a couple YA tropes, like I mentioned, the romance, pretty predictable, etc., etc. But I think it has enough other things going for it that make it really interesting and exciting. So I have already picked up the sequel because I want to find out what happens to these characters next. That's how much I enjoyed it. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not already, please subscribe to my channel for more bookish stuff coming your way soon. All right, everyone, happy reading.